Video games are the latest craze to sweep the country and most of the world, too. Millions of people are...
ColecoVision. 1982.
Video games are taking this country by storm.
The Commodore 64 personal...
The electronic game craze, which is not only fascinating...
The Atari 5200 Super System. Its only competition is you.
It's the video game years, and welcome to 1982. The systems, the culture, the games. An orange critter steals gamers' hearts.
He's not speaking in English, he's just talking in gibberish.
Coleco has a vision for a new console.
It looks like the arcade game. It's close.
And a gaming movie lights up the screen.
It was mind-blowing. I mean, it changed my life, you know?
Plus, Atari goes big, and robots run wild. So hop on your ostrich, but be sure to phone home. This is 1982.
The Atari 5200. This was my very first video game system. Well, one of them was.
I'm sorry.
The Atari 5200 was released in 1982, and it was supposed to be this great replacement for the Atari 2600, but of course, it wasn't.
So they throw in a new system, jack the price up, so their margins are better, and they come out with this system that, at the time, was already a little bit obsolete. It was packed in with Super Breakout. Yippee, Breakout, it's better. But for the most part, the reason why the 5200 wasn't that great in the grand scheme of things is because it was really just an upgrade.
I have to say, the Atari 5200 gets a really bad rap. It had some incredible arcade ports of, you know, they look great. You look at Pac-Man for the 2600, it looks like absolute shit. You look at Pac-Man for the Atari 5200, it looks like Pac-Man.
Most of the games on the system were not games that were unique to the system, like Miss Pac-Man, Pitfall, Centipede. They were better versions, or the close ports to the arcade version, better than 2600, but they weren't unique, so why bother getting it?
This is the two-player version, the two-port versus the four-port.
Now, I detest the controller with a passion. It's the absolute worst video game controller ever made.
And while the controllers had these nifty analog sticks, they couldn't recenter.
Right.
The non-centering analog was great for games like Centipede, Super Breakout, probably why it was packed in with the system, and Missile Command. Any game that used like
analog,
a spinner
yeah, or analog control
or a trackball.
Sure.
It was fine because you could move slow or you could zip around.
But that's not many games.
No, and it's certainly not the games that the majority of people played.
They were these just weird analog controllers. I think in theory they would have been great. They had a pause button on it.
It's like they tried to mix a controller with a telephone and something else horrible, and it just doesn't work.
Atari 5200 controllers had the reputation of breaking all the time.
They were notorious for breaking.
These are my Atari 5200 controllers that don't work. There's an RF switch, that's broken.
I think that time has treated the 5200 poorly. It's not a fondly remembered game system. It's easy to make fun of it because of the terrible controller, because of the fact it was a commercial failure. But in 1982, the thing was cool.
I love the Atari 5200 and I stand by it. I will always love that system. I mean, games like Pengo, Super Breakout, almost arcade perfect version of Pac-Man.
Pengo's actually probably the most miserable game to play with one of these.
Well, there you go. Pengo, don't get the 5200.
Arcade break.
Burgertime was released in 1982 by Data East for the arcades.
You play as Peter Pepper, the chef, and you walk around on food that people are going to eat. The game's horrifying.
Now, I've always been a germ freak, and I know what goes on in some kitchens, and this game did not help my paranoia one bit.
Yeah, are you cooking for like giants in the game? That's never really explained. Are you a midget? Are you a hobbit chef?
Are you like a little person and giant people are eating the burgers? It's a really trippy game. Just don't think about it.
It also used the Deco tape system, which Data East made to help streamline how some of their arcade releases were.
Mr. Pickle, Mr. Egg, and Mr. Wiener.
it actually used a physical tape and, you know, make another tape for a totally different game. This way you could use the same cabinet for various different games.
So pretty much the entire point to do is to get all those little creatures in your buns.
It's an early JAMA kind of scenario, but unfortunately the tape decks really sucked and they would crap out a lot and became unreliable.
So if you slapped your meat on Mr. Wiener, you could kill him.
The thing with Burgertime is I think most people who approach it play it similar to Pac-Man, and they try to avoid the enemies, whereas in Burgertime, you really want them to line up behind you.
It was like salt, right? And you throw salt at people. Man, that game.
It's a really frustrating game. It's a fun game, really tough, and yeah, it was kind of original at the time.
1 foot burger, please.
So Gottlieb was a big pinball machine company. And they decided, hey, we want to get into this video game craze. So they didn't have a lot of games that were well known. Their biggest hit though, a smash hit though, was QBert.
QBert wasn't the original name for this game. It was originally Snot and Boogers. How awesome is that? Man, I would have lost my shit if that was the final name, but I guess, you know, it was a little like juvenile, which of course I was a little kid, so it would have worked to me then, but now it'd be like, eh. So QBert works.
It's like an isometric pyramid kind of game where you move up and down trying to turn over each of the different cubes that you land on until you complete the whole puzzle.
You only had a couple of enemies to deal with, but they were kind of bouncing around and following you, so it was always interesting. And there was a couple of like discs on either side that you can kind of use as a one-time thing to get you back up to the top, sometimes to get out of a hairy situation, sometimes to reset yourself to get going down the other side.
What are you in QBert? You're some orange Muppet-looking thing with a big nose, you speak in gibberish, and you have a 4-way directional joystick, but on a diagonal, and that's how you do. You move along on this cube pyramid.
Because the board was like a pyramid, they actually mounted the joystick in a diagonal fashion. So you would actually move in diagonals.
Like a cross.
Right, instead of, you know, up, down, left, right, which was pretty innovative.
I don't know how much the arcade controls differ from the Atari controls, but on Atari, it's like, geez, I don't want to say it wrong, but if you hit like down, it kind of, you can fall off the side very easily, and either you're naturally kind of good with the QBert controls, or you suck at it. I happen to be really, really good at it, but most people I've ever played that game with hate it. They just think the controls are garbage.
One of the interesting things about QBert is it was one of the more licensed arcade games of the 80s. There was toys, there was a cartoon, there was a board game. It had its own incredibly weird and wacky pinball machine later on, but it really was Gottlieb's only known arcade hit.
Sure.
Best part about QBert, of course, is the iconic moment when you lose a life and the speech bubble shows up above him with kind of like different symbols to, you know, obviously they're getting at that he's swearing.
It kind of had this digitized, mumbly, jumbled voice that QBert had when he basically swore.
Yeah.
Well, originally the plan was to actually have there to be a noise, like an actual word that QBert would say, but the limitations of the chip prevented it, so the programmer just started putting random numbers in, and that's how we got QBert's swearing.
Actually, my Uncle Sean is on the Twin Galaxies record board in the top 5 or 10 for QBert, and that makes us proud as a family.
Arcade break. If you were around in 82, 83 especially, pole position was huge.
It's a Formula One racing game.
It was actually one of the first driving games that I played that actually had a steering wheel.
There were 2 different types of machines. You had a upright and you had a sit-down cabinet. The sit-down had a brake and an accelerator. I believe the upright only had an accelerator on it.
It was such an immersive experience because they had those environmental versions of the games where you sat inside and you had high and low gear.
Your greasy fingers slipping from all the pizza, doing everything you can to hold on to that steering wheel as you're going around those turns.
It's really strange playing a driving game with a pedal while you're standing up. It feels unnatural.
Pole Position was one of the first games to have product placement in the games.
Canon, Pepsi, Marlboro.
Was so popular, it was one of the handful of arcade games that had a cartoon, its own standalone cartoon, where it was like some sort of weird adventure team.
With kids, obviously, because It was the 80s, so all of your spies were children.
I guess it's hard to make a cartoon out of you being a single F1 racer going around the same track over and over again, so.
One of the cool things, or uncool things about pole position, is when you ran into anything, your car would explode, like a Ford Pinto.
Horrible flames and death.
Cruisin' USA was the pole position of the 90s. No, it wasn't.
January 1982, the Commodore 64 was introduced.
The Commodore 64 was once, twice, 3 times later.
The Commodore 64, best-selling personal computer of all time.
The reason it's called Commodore 64 is because it had 64 kilobytes of RAM.
One of the most famous sound chips in retro gaming.
The games had great sound because the SID chip inside of the Commodore 64 that was used for sound could do really incredible things for the time.
Commodore 64. More like the Commodore 64. Commies played that one.
It was my first computer system I ever had, and I never bought more than 3 games for the system because my uncle had 2 disk drives and would copy pretty much every single game from me.
I know that my dad used to network with a lot of people. He used to go to meetings that were specifically they were like Commodore meetings, where you get together with a bunch of people and they trade software, trade video games and stuff. So we just had discs crammed with games.
It was more of a gaming machine than it was a home computing machine. Maybe 50-50, but there was a lot of game programming on there.
It retailed for $5.95, which was a lot of money back then, but considering the competitors, the Apple II, for example, retailed for $1,200, it was significantly less than its competitors. The reason being is because you had to pretty much purchase everything separately.
Was it something that you saw regularly in an American household?
No.
So if you wanted a floppy drive, you wanted a printer, if you wanted other devices, a cassette player for this, you'd have to buy everything separately.
It was limited. It wasn't like you can get an IBM compatible, which can do a lot more than a Commodore. Not for games, but for home computing, for spreadsheets and word processing, which are still in infancy, but also the Apple II, you can do all this nice stuff. The Commodore, it was more inexpensive, but you can do a lot less on it, partially because of that.
One of the reasons why it was so freaking successful was it had just tons and tons of software for it. Like there were over 10,000 titles.
In Europe, consoles weren't that huge in the 80s. You had stuff like the BBC Micro, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, and you had the Commodore 64. Those were your main gaming machines in Europe. So in Europe, huge! Games coming out left and right. In the US, not a lot of games that were only on the Commodore 64. You have some ports coming on.
Dig Dug. I got my first experience with Dig Dug on the Commodore 64.
It was supported up until 1994, making it the longest supported computer of all time.
Congo Bongo. Burgertime.
She's a brick house. Sorry, Commodore's jokes.
School Days. Oh man, I love School Days.
Well, you have stuff like the Lemonade game, which I played in school. That was fun. A couple of things of sugar and lemonade mix, and hopefully it doesn't rain.
Has anybody else out there played School Days?
It's a heavy-ass keyboard. You can kill someone. You could. With the Commodore 64. It's all built in right in that freaking keyboard.
I mean, it's just an iconic startup screen, you know, with that 64K RAM. That's why it's Commodore 64. And then the ready prompt. You know, it's a lot more inviting, a lot more welcoming than that cold, harsh Microsoft DOS C prompt. You just ready to adventure or something. You know.
Arcade break.
Williams Joust. Frickin' ostriches.
John Newcomer went out to make a flying game, and he didn't want to use spaceships because those were cliche even at that time, so he had knights riding ostriches.
And I actually liked that game and played it more, I'd say, than any other video game ever.
So you flap your little ostrich wings, and you gotta hit the other ostrich knights, just a slightly higher level at least, and then you hit them off, and you collect the sort of like, I think, eggs for bonus points?
Yes.
Do you ever wonder where Super Mario Bros. 2 got the idea for riding on ostriches? No? Now I feel ostracized.
That's the entire game. One screen, ostriches flying on by. It's bizarre. It's some sort of like really weird you know, like heavy metal animated world or something going on.
I'm gonna go stick my head in the sand.
Honestly, the best part about Joust, other than the whole ridiculous nature of it, is how satisfying it is to just splurt on top of the enemies and turn them into eggs. I don't even know if that's a word, but that's what it feels like, and it feels good.
And now the other arcade games of 1982.
Hey guys, I'm Pixel Dan, and these are the other arcade games of 1982. Nibbler. This Pac-Man and Snake mashup is the first video game where you can reach 1 billion points. Pengo, the overhead ice maze game where you control a cute little red penguin who crushes the snow bees. Yeah! Satan's Hollow, the shoot-'em-up game where you destroy gargoyles in order to build a bridge that leads directly to Satan. Why would you do that? Star Trek, the vector game that boldly goes where no man has gone before. I just can't do it, Captain! So there you go, guys. There are the other arcade games of 1982. So grab yourself a fistful of quarters and meet me in the arcade.